time. I mean, now, so you're a physiologically healthy young woman, and you've just announced that you want to undergo a form of radical surgery that's generally reserved for advanced stage cancer survivors. And the upshot of that is you're hustled off to a specialist who can facilitate that. There's no investigation into all the background issues that we've been talking about instead.
Well, it was just seen as it was part of the process. Like, there was really no psychological evaluation before it.
Yeah, that's utterly appalling. Yeah. You know, I've been embarrassed for years to be a member of the Intellectual Academy under the current conditions that universities, what would you say, have put themselves into. And I'm equally embarrassed to be part of the therapeutic community to hear a story like yours. It's absolutely appalling what happened to you. There's no excuse whatsoever for it. It's such a dereliction of responsibility that it's almost unimaginable. So it's really too bad that you weren't listened to in a lot more detail and with a lot more care, you know? Because what you went through, it's not that abnormal. You know, everything you told me about your unhappiness as a teenager, the fact that you were isolated in middle school, the fact that you had some doubts about your developing identity, it's like, yeah, that's pretty much par for the course for adolescents. Some kids get through it with a little less scarring than others, but most adolescents have a pretty damn miserable time for about 3 years. And so the fact that that led you down a path to hormonal transformation and then surgery, and that adults aided and abetted this, you know, I have some sympathy for your parents, because when parents are told, you better support your child or it'll be suicide, it's like, well, that backs them into a corner. But the medical professionals and the counselors who dealt with you, that their negligence borders, their negligence, it doesn't just border on the criminal, it crosses the boundary as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so now you're set, you go off to see a specialist. Who's the specialist and how do they treat you?
It's important to note that, I mean, it absolutely was negligence, because not only was I given surgery for a problem that was psychological in nature, in the months before that, that was when I had been diagnosed with depression and social anxiety, and when my suicidal ideation started happening. I was, you know, at the beginning, they told my parents, like, your child will be at risk of suicide if you don't affirm her identity. But it wasn't until after I started the treatments that I started feeling like committing suicide.
Yeah. Did you have a plan?
No, I never really had a plan, but the feeling was prevalent enough to that it affected my day-to-day life.
Right. So when you assess people for suicidality, essentially what you do is you investigate the structures of their fantasies and their wishes. And the more developed the plan they have, the higher the probability is that they'll actually commit suicide, right? So if it's a fully developed plan, place, location, implement, all of that, then the person's really at risk. Otherwise, and it sounds like this was the case in your case, it's more a marker of generalized depression and anxiety, because that will often spin off, you know, quasi-suicidal thoughts like, well, maybe it would be better for everyone else if I wasn't here, or life is too difficult, and so, you know, it would be simpler, all things considered, just to bring it to an end. You know, that's bad, and it's also associated with a fair bit of suffering, but those thoughts in and of themselves are not associated with a high risk of, you know, imminent suicide. So, okay, but in any case, you were miserable enough at this point. Well, obviously, then you'd be looking for what? Further alleviation of your psychological symptoms. And you said the binding was very uncomfortable and troublesome. And so so that also led you to conclude that it just might be simpler, all things considered, since you were already on the pathway to being a boy, just to go down the surgical route.
Yeah.
So you were 14 when that happened?
I was 15 at this time. I was in my sophomore year of high school.
You were
They
15.
also started, to treat my depression, they decided to medicate me for it. And, you know, from what little I knew about about medicating depression. I often heard that SSRIs have all these terrible side effects, so I asked that they put me on something with as few side effects as possible, and they decided to put me on Wellbutrin, which I didn't know until after I stopped taking it, but it actually has like a huge black box label warning on it for use in children and adolescents, and it actually made me feel more suicidal over time.
Okay. All right. So now you're 15 and you go see a specialist in relationship to surgery. How were you evaluated at that point? When you actually moved forward for the surgery?
I don't remember much of it, but it was, I mean, obviously they didn't really do an evaluation of my mental health. It was just like, oh, so you're transitioning, you identify as a boy and you've been on hormones for such and such amount of time. So I was eligible. And after my first appointment, the surgeon told me about a top surgery classroom that was taking place in the hospital building and encouraged me and my parents to attend it. And I went, and I learned basically the same things that I learned in the surgeon's office, about like the different types of incisions and how it benefits gender dysphoria, basically just propaganda. There are maybe about like 12 to 15 or so other families in there. I noticed right away that all the other kids in there looked to be either younger than me or like they hadn't even started on hormones yet. And I was shocked that they were already seeking surgery. But I didn't really question it much of the time. It was just like, I guess this is just normal, and I'm not the only one going through this.
Right. Well, and you were already a long way down the road, and so I guess you checked off the boxes as far as the medical practitioners were concerned. But at that point, it's also, for you, it's going to be increasingly difficult to reverse your decision. You're already in a couple of years, and that's a long time when you're only 14. And so it was on to the next step. So that happened when you were 15. Yeah. And so what was the consequence of the double mastectomy for you? What's been the consequence?
By this point in time, I was 2 or 3 years on testosterone, and I'd been binding for roughly the same amount of time, and my breasts had lost their shape. They didn't look like they used to before. They didn't really have, they didn't, to me, it just looked strange. And I actually just started developing more insecurities with my body as I went through my transition. Like I had like these masculine features pop up, but it was all still on a female body. And there is like an incongruence between different features on my body, and especially my breasts. Like it was this masculine looking body with quite a bit of muscle, and yet these things were there and they weren't really in the best shape. And it became a source of insecurity for me. And, I thought that even if I wanted to, my chest would never be the same again. And so there was not really any point in keeping it. And before I went under the knife, they did tell me that I was going to lose my ability to breastfeed, but it was like, I'm going to be a man, and men don't do that. I also wasn't really thinking about being a parent at all, because I was a kid. Actually, this is kind of reminiscent of the of one of the appointments for getting the testosterone. My endocrinologist asked me some questions that were very adult in nature. I was basically being sexualized by my doctors. It was like, are you aware that you may experience vaginal atrophy, or are you aware that this may affect your ability to have children as an adult? And I just went along with it. It was like, oh yeah, I know that. I don't plan on having kids, and I also I never had sex by that point, so I didn't know just what effect any of that would have on my body. But I was being treated as if I were an adult with the mental faculties to be able to consent to all of this and understand what I was consenting to. But I wasn't. I was just a kid.
Okay, and so what happened in the aftermath of the surgery? What was that like for you?
You know, when I woke up and I was fully conscious, all the meds had worn off, and I realized what just happened. But I was actually quite happy. You know, it was like, wow, this is a huge accomplishment. This is a huge step, and you know, I can finally be myself. And I was looking forward to being healed and eventually being able to go out and swim and work out and just hang out without a shirt and look like all the other boys and not have to worry about wearing this uncomfortable, restrictive thing. And, you know, it was an outpatient surgery. Got sent home pretty soon after that. And I had a comfy, I guess you'd say, few weeks after that because my mom had to take some time off work to just help me around the house. It was a major surgery in my upper body, and I lost a considerable amount of my range of motion. I couldn't even lift up my arms over my head until maybe about like 3 or 4 months afterward. So I wasn't really in a state to be going out on my own. But after about a week or so was when reality started to hit. I had to get my stitches taken out a few days afterward, and the sensation was just insane. Like, they had to cut and rearrange some nerve endings, so it was numb, but I could also feel everything that they were doing when they were taking out the stitches. And it felt so disgusting. And once I went home and I was able to finally bathe again, that was when I started having to, that's when I had to take off the surgical binder and the dressings and look down at what was left of my chest. You know, I had these big scars and all these markings from a surgical marker, and on top of that, I will, just a warning, I will get into graphic detail here, but the type of incision that I got was called double incision with nipple grafts, meaning that they would not only take out the breast tissue and contour the chest to look more masculine, they would also remove like the way it was explained to me, I guess because I was young and they were trying to make it more digestible to a 15-year-old, was that they would leave like a deep scrapes on both sides of my chest, kind of like a deep knee scrape, but more controlled. And they would remove my nipples and then place them in that area of scraped skin in they called it a more masculine positioning and shape. It's barbaric, to say the least. And when I took the dressings off, when I looked down, the grafts were black because, you know, during the surgery, during the operation, the blood supply was cut off, and so the outer layer of skin had died. And they said that was how it was supposed to be, and that was just part of the process. But I couldn't bear to see that part of my body. I had to see that every night. I had to change my... that was what I had to look at every single night after every bath, after every shower.
What happened to you in relationship to sensation? Like, because that's a long-term, you know, physiological and sexual consequence. And so you lose the ability to breastfeed, obviously, and there's a profound physiological alteration in your appearance. But what happens to you on the sensation side? What has happened?
It's certainly not the same. It's gotten a lot better over the years. I mean, initially I would get like a lot of, it felt like sparks electricity as like the nerve endings grew back, but it's strange. Like I can move like a hand over a certain area of my chest and it'll feel like it's in my arm or something. And I have basically no erogenous sensation in the grafts.
Yeah. Okay. So it wasn't long after this that you started to have doubts about what you were doing. Now, you told me earlier in this discussion that at some point you started thinking about having children. And so, but then also that you decided to stop your transition when you were 16. So how did that lay itself out after you had the surgery? And how did you come to the decision that the decision you had made was not a good one?
Not long after, I'd say maybe about a month or two, I started realizing that, I missed looking pretty and having softer features in a more feminine form. But this was something that I kind of repressed for a while. I was about 3 years on testosterone by this point, and I didn't even look like a woman anymore. I thought there was no going back and there would be no point. But at the same time, I would also buy makeup and skirts and dresses and just wear it in the comfort of my room or when nobody was home to see it. And this caused a great deal of distress for me. And after the surgery, I just kept getting worse. I just kept justifying it in my head as it being part of the post-op process. But I never really got any better. And it wasn't until maybe about 11 months after the surgery that I realized what the problem was. And, I was taking a psychology class at this point. I had a lesson, I had a chapter on child development and parenting. And one of the lessons was about the Harlow experiments with the rhesus monkeys, the ones exploring the relationship between a mother and her child, how things like physical affection and breastfeeding affect that. And I realized that my breasts were so much more than just sexual organs. They were a means of not only feeding my kid, but also I lost so much more than that.
Of providing them with love and attention. Yeah, well, look, there's a woman named Tiffany Fields. She studied the work of a man named Riak Panksepp, and Panksepp showed that in order for rat pups to develop properly, they had to be physically stimulated, touched, licked, loved. The experimenters can duplicate that by massaging them with the end of a pencil eraser. Anyways, Tiffany Fields showed that if you took premature kids that were in an incubator and you massaged them 3 times a day for 10 minutes, that they developed as fast physically as children in utero. There's a huge body of research showing that skin-to-skin contact is crucial. That's physical love. That skin-to-skin contact is a crucial part of establishing the domain of love that's necessary for children to flourish. Food, shelter, the provision of adequate water, etc. Those basics are necessary, but that physical contact and love is equally necessary. And so it's definitely the case that, breastfed children tend to thrive more thoroughly, right? And that's partly a nutritional issue, but it's also partly an issue of the fact that a lot of the love that's maternal love that entices children into life is a consequence of physical contact. And so, that's a hell of a realization. So that started to dawn on you in high school after you had the surgery.
Yeah, I felt like a monster.
And you were starting to think about having kids at that point. And so why? What do you think that was triggered by the surgery? What switched you?
I think it was most of that class. I was learning a lot about myself and also about parenting and about children. And that was when I realized, I think I want to have kids someday. And, I started really thinking about it, not only not only about how it relates to having lost my breasts, but also, my fertility might be affected by having to start testosterone so young.
And do you know whether that is the case now? Have you been tested in any manner that indicates whether the blockers and the testosterone have interfered with your fertility?
I don't know. By the time that I started, I did start having periods, but I was so young by that point. They weren't regular. I was only having about 3 to 4 per year. That was also another source of stress for me about being a woman.
Right,
it was scary. Like all the other girls my age would talk about, like how, they got theirs every month or every 2 months, and I learned it's a myth now, but they would talk about how like their cycles would supposedly sync with like family members or friends, and I was like, why isn't that happening to me? And so it was just another thing that piled that made me feel like I was broken. Luckily, after stopping,
Right.
luckily after stopping, about 2 months later, I got my period back, and it's been surprisingly quite regular since. I don't know if I went through some development.
Oh, well, that's a good sign.
That is a good sign.
Right. Well, that's a good sign. That must be a relief, so to speak.
But there's so many other factors that play into that. I haven't been able to get tested, and I'm just not really sure of what's to come. But
Yeah.
I'm hopeful.
Right. Okay, so when did you stop taking the testosterone, and when did you announce this to your parents? Well, when did you announce this to yourself and then to your parents and all the other people around you who knew?
I think after my junior year wrapped up, one night I just kind of broke down crying, and I realized that I regretted my transition, and I called a friend and I texted my mom. I couldn't call her or talk to her about it in person because, I had a lot of guilt. I had a lot of shame, and I didn't want to let her and dad and the rest of the family down after so many years of doing this. And they invested
Right.
their time and their money into doing this, and it was pretty much for nothing. And I hated that. It was also just shameful to admit that I was wrong after so much time, especially since I didn't even look like a girl anymore by that point.
Right. Yeah, well, it's quite remarkable in some sense that you did reverse your decision, and you seem to be indicating to me that it was the realization that you wanted to have children that was the real telling moment of transformation, was it?
It was definitely one of the biggest catalysts.
And how do you think you figured that out? Because that, it's actually pretty young to figure that out. I've met many women now who, there's lots of women your age who are absolutely hell-bent and convinced that they're never going to have kids, that the only pathway forward to them that's valid is the career pathway. But I'll tell you that, I'm 60 years old now, and I've worked with women in female-dominated businesses my whole life because I'm in the psychological profession, and so that's female-dominated. And virtually every woman I've ever met, with almost no exceptions, and this includes extremely high-achieving women on the career front, pretty much by the time they're in their late 20s, their primary goal is to have a child. And that's even the case. Now, sometimes that kicks in for women later than that. I've seen that as well, but it's an extremely rare woman who goes through her entire young life without being seized by the desire to have a child. And so, but it's early in your case. So, and it's strange, right, in some ways, because you'd fought against this so hard. Why the hell do you think it made itself manifest as a desire when you were 16? Like, do you think you knew that you were really like on the cutting edge in some sense, that if you kept pushing this, you were really going to sacrifice your ability to have kids? Or what do you think produced the realization?
I think, I already had my guard down by that point. Because this was around when when COVID hit and there were all the restrictions put into place, and I was basically doing online school only, and I had a lot of isolation from the outside world, and this caused me a significant amount of stress, but it also allowed for a lot more time to be alone and reflect, and so it opened up my mind a little bit. And
so what were you fantasizing about on the family front when you were looking forward into the future? You were thinking about having, did you have some idea of how many kids you wanted to have? Did you have some idea about the marriage or the family structure? What was making itself manifest in your fantasy?
I mean, when I started, I was so young that I wasn't even thinking about all that yet. But as the years passed and I started to think about like my adulthood, what I wanted to do as an adult, that thought started to pop into my head a little bit more. I never really thought about it very much until I learned about child psychology and just being a parent. I think I would have naturally had that realization if I knew more about parenting and family.
Hey, do you know when you were a kid, do you know if you played with dolls?
Yeah, I did.
You did. Okay, so that was there. Can you remember whether or not you enjoyed that? I know that's a long time ago.
I did.
And were they baby dolls or were they Barbies?
They were Barbies and Bratz.
Okay, so they were teenage dolls. Did you have any baby dolls?
Not that I can remember.
Okay. See, that's interesting. You know, even among chimpanzees, if you allow chimpanzee juveniles free choice, the males will pick trucks and wheeled things and gadgets, and the females will pick dolls. And the female chimps will carry the dolls around, teddy bears and so forth, for months and develop a very deep attachment to them. And, you know, one of the things, it's really necessary for young girls, and perhaps for young boys, but certainly for young girls, to play with baby dolls. It's really necessary because that's all part of that practicing that deep female role. And, you know, without that, well, you don't have a chance. That's how kids think, eh? They think by playing. And if they don't have a chance to play that out, then, well, they don't explore that. And so it didn't even make it manifest in your own life until you were like 16 and had gone through all this bloody misery. All right, so when did you start thinking about taking legal action, and why do you think that's justifiable?
That was quite a bit further down the line. I should probably go into first about the detransition process for me and what led up to me eventually starting to speak out and doing that, When I had this realization, I mean, that night when I broke down and I talked to my friend and my mom and my dad about it, but that was the night that I stopped taking testosterone and I decided that I would just grow my hair out and buy new clothes and just figure things out from there. I went for about a week, just not really doing anything. I was just kind of at rock bottom at that point, and I didn't really see a reason to do anything anymore. I just stayed in my bed or in my bedroom all day, didn't really go out except to use the restroom or get some food. But mom and dad would come and check in on me, and it was comforting, and that kept me going. And then I had to figure out everything from there pretty much on my own. I told my endocrinologist, I told my therapist, my endocrinologist, and my gender specialist that I regretted my transition very deeply, that I was going to stop. And I didn't really get a whole lot of guidance on it. I guess they really couldn't, because it would be against the law to suggest anything other than...
Well, that's a tricky one, right? Because, well, hypothetically, once you announce that, they're also legally bound to go along with that, right? So they could have agreed with you. I mean, look, I have a certain amount of sympathy for counselors and medical practitioners because they're facing supreme hell on their regulatory college front. But But having said that, I would also say that their fundamental duty of care is to the individual and not to the bloody regulating colleges. And so, but they could have taken your regrets seriously. You said that, did you face opposition, or was it just a matter of lack of guidance?
It was mostly a lack of guidance. Nobody really opposed it, but I started requesting blood tests from my endocrinologist, and when I got I specifically told her that I no longer identify as male, and I want the guidelines for a female my age. And when I got the results back, they were sent with the guidelines for the average sex hormone levels for a teenage boy. So that was kind of that was one of the first moments that really woke me up to the fact that these people weren't going to help me.
Well, it's weird, because if your medical people were so convinced that you were 100% right when you decided to transition to begin with, and you were right enough to take the hormones and have the surgery, you'd think that there'd be some resistance to your sudden change of heart. But it sounds like you basically encountered the same lackadaisical response to the second decision that you did to the first decision. So, which it's not surprising, although it's horrible.
Yeah, I was basically entirely patient-led.
Right. Okay, so, all right, so you decided to take legal action. And so walk us through that.
Yeah, earlier this year, I started to start speaking out publicly about my experience with transitioning and then stopping transition. Before that, I actually had lost a lot of friends, both from school and online, over it, over the course of my detransition, because a lot of them, I had a pretty strong change in a lot of my views, and a lot of them disagreed with me heavily, and they were very upset with me. There was one person who kept harassing me just because I regretted it and said that I deserved to feel that way, that I didn't deserve to have parents who loved me enough to let me go through this. And there were a lot of others who said that I was just making them uncomfortable and that I shouldn't be voicing any of this because it would be harming other real transgender people who needed this treatment. And I did, yeah.
Oh, the real ones, I see.
I gave in to this pressure, and I did stop talking about it for a while. But I also got involved in communities online of people who regretted their transitions. And I realized that that wasn't the case at all, and that I just couldn't shut up because this is something that's happening more often than even I thought was happening. I didn't even know that detransition was a thing until it happened to me. And, I knew that there's got to be so many other people in the situation, especially kids who are being pressured by their friends to stay silent about their pain. And it's not necessarily that I want to speak out about it, but I feel called to. And so I started this year. And
what do you think? What do you think is the core of your claim that you fell prey to, say, medical and counseling malpractice? What do you think was done wrong with you?
Quite a lot, actually. The most immediate thing I can think of would be the fact that the consent forms weren't really comprehensive. They were very vague. They didn't list they didn't have nearly enough information on them. And I was also just too young to really fathom what any of this meant. And you can make the argument that my parents...
Well, consent has to be documented, but it also has to be informed. And informed means you have to understand what you're consenting to. And so from my perspective, especially when you were really young, say around 12, and you first went into therapy, There should have been a very deep investigation into your background and then a laying out of a whole comprehensive range of options and a lengthy discussion of the consequence of all of those options. And your parents, after the discussion had taken place with you, your parents should have been brought into that and they should have been walked through the same range of options. And then you all should have been offered, what would I would say, the opportunity or the necessity to take a fair amount of time to really think it through, on the fundamental basis that, well, we won't do anything precipitous until it's necessary, right? And that harkens back to the idea that if you leave most kids with gender dysphoria be, most of them identify as homosexual, as I said, eventually, but most of them, the vast majority of them, accept their biological status. And so the consent issue, it isn't only that the forms were vague and didn't detail out the full range of consequences, it's that you needed to be walked through in great detail all of the issues that were relevant to you on the psychological and medical front, all the options that were available to you, and the pros and cons of all those options. And that should have been something that took, I would think that I can't see in any possible way that could have been done with any degree of thoroughness in something under 6 months of weekly therapy. And I would say that's an absolute minimum to walk anyone through something as complicated as what you laid out. So that's on the informed front, right?
Yeah, they really presented this as basically the only option to both me and my parents. And I also, the problem with me starting it so young was not only that I couldn't consent, I couldn't really fathom the full picture of things. I've also I'm still experiencing a wide range of complications to this day. From the surgery, I'll never be able to breastfeed. I'll never have that erogenous sensation in my chest back. I'll never have my breast back. A reconstruction will do nothing for me, and it might make things worse actually because I've had some complications pop up this year with the grafts. I have to cover them up with bandages, or else I don't know what's going on with them. I tried to consult my surgeon about it, and he didn't really investigate. He gave me advice that made the complications worse even, and actually temporarily gave me an infection. But I have to bandage up every day so that it doesn't leak all over my clothing or bedding. And
Jesus,
from the hormones and blockers, I've been experiencing some joint pains, mainly in my arms, my legs, and my back. And I still have issues with my urinary tract. I have to use the restroom pretty frequently, and I didn't even know that this was possible. This is a pretty huge quality of life issue that I'm experiencing, and I'm just not really getting any help for it. And on top of that, I do hate to speak about it, but I'm experiencing sexual dysfunction at the age of 18. That's something that women usually go through when they're in their 40s to 50s.
Right.
How was I supposed to know?
So let's talk for a moment about how you got your lawyers and where you are on the legal battlefront.
So, not only is what's happened to me completely unethical, completely wrong, it's caused me a lot of physical damage and emotional damage as well. I'm still picking up the pieces of my life to this day, and I often find myself feeling like a broken woman, all because of a choice that I made, that I was allowed to make as a kid. And I think it's very clear just how wrong all this is. None of this should have been allowed to happen.
What has happened legally? Have you served a set of people with notice that you're taking legal proceedings, or are you still in the planning stages of that?
So we've filed a letter of intent to sue against Kaiser, my healthcare provider, as well as the hospital that I underwent the surgery at. And the surgeon who did it, the gender specialist who referred me to that surgeon, and the endocrinologist who had put me on hormones. We're still in the 90-day period.
Right. So this is all just unfolding now. So you're going to end up with a pretty damn thorough medical and legal education by the time you're done all of this, and media education as well. That's for sure. So look, we should wrap this part up. For everyone who's watching and listening, I'm going to talk to Chloe for another half an hour on the Daily Wire Plus platform. I think what I'm going to do, I often walk people through the development of their career, but that's not relevant in her situation. What I'm going to do instead is talk to Chloe about, she was recently at an event with Matt Walsh, and I want to talk to her about that, and I want to talk to her about the response she's got from the gender, let's say, ideologues and activists in relationship to going public with her decision to detransition. So we're going to delve into that for about half an hour. And so if those of you who are watching and listening found this interesting and you're inclined, switch over to the Daily Wire Plus platform and we'll fill in the political end of this, at least to some degree. And Chloe, thank you very much for talking to me today. And it's really, what happened to you is really unforgivable in my estimation. You know, you were very badly mishandled by the people who should have been taking care of you on the professional front. And you were, offered a pathway forward that I can see to be highly tempting for someone in your situation. But there were many, 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 many other options available to you on the therapeutic front that would have resolved the problems that you've had to the degree that human problems can ever be resolved without having to wander through this bloody, catastrophic labyrinth of pain and suffering and confusion that you've been subject to for the last 5 years. And so I hope that you can get yourself back on proper footing and move forward. And I wish you all the luck there is on the legal front. I hope your damn legal system in the United States isn't so corrupted already by all this woke nonsense so that it'll be impossible for you to proceed. But I suspect that the medical community who's been complicit in this kind of butchery has an awful shock waiting for them on the legal front. That's certainly started to manifest itself in the UK with the closing of the Tavistock Clinic. And I think there's 1,000 lawsuits right now pending in relationship to the Tavistock Clinic. So the tide is beginning to turn, and when it turns, there's going to be an awful lot of reparations made on the part of culpable medical professionals and their counseling acolytes. So good luck with that, eh? And keep your head up. And we'll flip over to the Daily Wire Plus platform. For all those of you watching and listening, thank you very much for your time and attention. And thanks again, Chloe, for being willing to wander through this, relatively painful personal territory.
Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I would encourage you to continue listening to my conversation with my guest on dailywireplus.com.